In the fall of 1975, I'm in a preaching class, and our teacher introduces us to a fabulous little book called Preaching the Gospel from the Gospels. And he just made the comment, he said, in our teaching and preaching, and obviously being members of the Church of Christ, then teaching from the life of Christ should be something that we major in, and it's something that's near and dear to us. But the titles of the chapters in this little book, Preaching the Gospel from the Gospels, simply said, you can preach the gospel from the life of Christ, you can preach the gospel from the miracles, you can preach the gospel from the teaching of Christ, and you can preach the gospel from parables. And one of Philip Slate's comments was, he said, not that they would have a 3x5 card, but something that we would do. He said, you look at most of, for example, the parables and the miracle stories, they're something that would fit on a 3x5. There's something you can kind of carry with you. They could go either on a 3x5 card. For us, we could take a card out of our pocket and work from that. But he said they're memorable teachings and events that people could use to preach the gospel from. But the one I'd like for us to think about today is the life of Jesus. You can teach, preach, learn the good news from the life of Jesus. Something that's been kind of, and comical is not the word, because so many people have been upset, but with all the rules about masks and all this other stuff, a number of our political leaders have been photographed after they have legislated and forced everyone else to wear masks, and whether they're at the Super Bowl or getting their hair fixed or something, a number of our leaders have been, like I said, photographed after they've legislated everyone else wears a mask, then they don't do it themselves. And one of the expressions that has come up is that they make rules for thee, but not for me. And there has been a lot of discussion politically about the people who have legislated something that they're not willing to do themselves. In contrast to that, think about this from the life of Jesus. He not only taught the gospel, but in his life and in his example, he lived the gospel. And one of the things that always stands out to me is that at the trial, at the very end of his life, they even bring in a multitude of false witnesses, and their testimony didn't agree. And if he had done anything that contradicted his teaching, contradicted the gospel, then that would have been brought forth and would have been a very major thing. Several of us in our adult classes are working through lessons on the Sermon on the Mount, and I'd like to do two things in this particular lesson. One, I'd like for us to look at just 5 brief examples of things in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus teaches a principle, and then we see this principle being lived out in his life. And the bottom line of this is that we're going to see a complete consistency is the word I'm looking for. There's a consistency between what he teaches and how he lives. And so we can also say, in terms of preaching the gospel from his life was a testimony, it was a complement to the things that he taught. There's a passage in John 8:24 that Jesus says, I always do what pleases him. And there was this sense in his life, and one of the goals of his life was to live his life both in harmony and in consistency with the teaching of God. But something I've noticed this time in going through the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm thinking of Moses on the first hand. Moses goes up on the mountain. He's there actually for 40 days and 40 nights. But when he comes down from the mountain, then he has these 2 tablets of stone, the 10 commandments, and these are given to him from God. And it's very interesting is that when you read the opening of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus goes up on a mountain, sits down, teaches the people, and then when he comes down to perform what Matthew's going to give us as the 10 signs, Matthew's very specific. He comes down from the mountain. And you kind of hear these echoes of the first lawgiver going up on the mountain, coming back with the 2 tablets of stone in each hand. In the second case, the one who's called Emmanuel, God with us, goes up and he sits down and he opens his mouth and he teaches the people, saying, for example, blessed are the poor in spirit. And the teaching that came in the second case wasn't given in 2 tablets of stone. It was given both in his words and then in his life and in the example that he lived. So 5 quick examples. And then the second part, we're going to just look at prayer in the life of Jesus as it kind of surrounds our teaching about the Lord's Prayer. The first one is, Jesus says, love you. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, and then he goes into this specific teaching, you pray for your enemies, you seek their well-being, you do things that are good for them. And what's very interesting is that, especially Mark will tell us as early as chapter 3, that the Pharisees and the Herodians are making plans to kill Jesus. And he's very aware of this. And so for Jesus to say, love your enemies, this is not like it might be for us, a hypothetical. He has people in virtually every audience, every teaching situation, who are just waiting for him to say something wrong. They're checking on him. They're scrutinizing. They're just watching him like a hawk all the time. And so when Jesus tells us to love our enemies, for him, that was not a hypothetical. That was something that was very real. And in fact, in time, his actual enemies are going to kill him. I'd like to read a passage just before the Sermon on the Mount, and this will be from Matthew 4. And it's going to become a quotation from the Old Testament, but notice what it says. The land of Naphtali by the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness saw a great light, and to them which sat in the region the shadow of death, light has sprung up. And a quotation before the Sermon on the Mount from the Old Testament speaks about Galilee, the land of the Gentiles, is going to be seeing this great light. And as Jesus sits down and begins to teach and preach, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, one of the things that he tells us and the original listeners in the Sermon on the Mount is, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men put a lamp, a candle under a bushel type thing. And so Jesus refers to disciples as the light of the world. But it's very interesting later in the Gospel of John, Jesus will say, I am the light of the world. And so Jesus doesn't ask his disciples and his followers to be something that he wasn't or didn't do himself, whichever way you want to look at that. A fourth one, real quick, is just Jesus says we're to forgive our debtors. And very specifically, he says, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Lead us not into temptation. And when we see Jesus on the cross, he has told us in the Sermon on the Mount, you should be forgiving. What does he say? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And another one, and this is something that was very much within his personality, Jesus is going to say, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And we're going to find in one of those final trips as he comes to Jerusalem, there are several occasions, but Jesus is going to look out over the city of Jerusalem, and Luke 19 is going to say, when he drew near, he saw the city and he wept over it. And whether it's telling people, blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. Later, Jesus is going to say, come unto me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest, for I am meek and lowly in your heart. And it's a very simple point, but I think it's very important for us. Jesus embodied in his personal life what his teaching was. And on the road to Emmaus, there's that wonderful expression, they don't recognize him, and they say, ask, who was this Jesus? And the two men say, well, he was a prophet mighty in word and deed. And one of the things I'd like for us to be challenged by is for in our personal lives, for us to realize we are going to be the gospel to people around us. One of my teachers had this wonderful expression. He said, there are people that meet you who will never read the Bible, but they will read you like a book. And sometimes the only gospel that some people may see is the gospel in our lives, and there's always that wonderful potential. Like, for example, preaching the gospel from the Gospels, we can preach the gospel from the life of Jesus, and as his disciples, our lives can also be gospel for people today. I'd like to do one other thing, and this will take just a little bit, but just give you something to think about. I'd like to ask you a thought question. Out of the four Gospels, which Gospel has the most frequent reference to prayer? And I just put in the word pray and just did a word search on it. And out of the four, which do you think it is? Most people will be surprised to find out it's the book of Luke. And when you just look at pray, it's 16 times in Matthew, 12 times in Mark, 27 times in Luke, and 3 times in John. And so Luke has more references to specific occasions, either both in teaching and here we are in practice, where Jesus is involved in prayer. And then when you look at Acts, there are 31 examples of people being involved in prayer in the book of Acts in one form or another. So in Luke and Acts, we have 58 examples of people who are involved in prayer. I didn't write these down, but when you look at those early chapters in Luke, several of the people who are around Jesus are people of prayer. That's going to be something that's very significant. But I just want to highlight, and we'll walk through these very quickly. I'll just give you the chapter if you want to make a note, because I know we're taping this. If you want to make a note, these would be easy to find. So I'll just give the chapter. But here's what we're going to see. At every major event, every major crossroads, every time there's something significant that is about to happen in the ministry of Jesus, Luke tells us before that takes place, Jesus is involved in prayer. And for example, we're going to have a prayer service before affirming the faith, which is such a wonderful thing to do. But something that we should be doing in our personal lives as we imitate Jesus is that he anticipates all of the major events in his life and that he is involved in prayer to God before those events take place. For example, in Luke 3, Luke tells us all the people were being baptized, and when Jesus had been baptized and was praying, the heavens were open. So his baptism is a point of prayer. Luke 5 tells us as the ministry begins and he's teaching and preaching and announcing the news of the coming of the kingdom, he would often withdraw to a desolate place and pray. And what did he say on the Sermon on the Mount? Do not be like the hypocrites. Go into your closet. And the primary audience when we pray is God. And I oftentimes think of David as a shepherd boy. He learns to play his harp in front of sheep. And sheep aren't going to complain if you miss an E flat or something doesn't come out quite right. But I read a wonderful comment once. He said, while his original audience was sheep, as he matured, David never forgot that his primary audience was God. And so when we pray, and yes, we should pray publicly, and yes, we should pray in classes, but this part of the life of Jesus is that when he taught them, you go into your closet and you pray in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Here's this compliment and this example. So as he's involved in his ministry, then he withdraws and prays. Luke 6, he's getting ready to appoint the 12 apostles. What eternal significance is going to come about from the 12 apostles? And he went to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. When the time comes for Peter to confess, you are the Christ, the Son of God, As he was praying alone, the disciples were with him in Luke 9, and he says, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" So before the confession of Peter, which is such a significant event, then Jesus is involved in prayer. When we come to the Transfiguration, 8 days after this, he took Peter, James, and John, and he went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered. His clothes became dazzling white. In Luke 11, while Jesus is praying, the disciples come and say, "Lord, teach us to pray." And this is the place where Luke introduces the complement in his account to the Sermon on the Mount, the teaching on prayer. And Jesus says, when you pray, "Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come." But the teaching about the Lord's Prayer in the Gospel of Luke is occasioned when he is praying and his disciples come to them. In Luke 18, as he is teaching them in parables, then he taught them that they ought always to pray and not to lose heart. And then in Luke 19, the cleansing of the temple, "My house shall be a house of prayer. You have made it a den of robbers." And in the Gospel of Luke, the expression is used as the Lord's Supper is instituted. He took bread, and when he had given thanks. And what a wonderful expression of gratitude. And obviously this happens in personal meals, but I oftentimes think, isn't this a wonderful expression of our gratitude to God that the Lord's Supper was instituted by Jesus giving thanks? He took the bread, broke it, gave it to them. "This is my body." And likewise, he took the cup. And again, an example of prayer as the Lord's Supper is instituted. Just shortly after that, he says to Peter, and this has to do with temptation, "Peter, I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have returned, strengthen your brothers." And what an appropriate thing to do in times of temptation for Jesus to be involved in praying. Gethsemane. Jesus withdraws before he goes to the cross, takes the 3 disciples with him, and tells them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew a stone's throw. He knelt down, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And Luke tells us, his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. And then he arose from prayer, and he said to the disciples, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you enter not into temptation." One of the things that is also very interesting is that the 2 men on the road to Emmaus after the resurrection are with Jesus. He is teaching them from Moses and from the prophets and explaining things to them. They encourage him to come and stay with them for a short period of time. And isn't it interesting, when do they recognize him? Luke tells us in Luke 24, he was at the table with them. He took bread, he blessed it, broke it, and it gave it to them, and their eyes were opened. And they have been with him, they've walked with him, they didn't recognize him. He has taught them from the Old Testament. These are the things that would happen. But the recognition of Jesus came about through the fact of him giving thanks and praying. And the final one is as significant as all of them. What's the very, very last thing that Jesus does with the apostles? Luke 24, he led them out as far as Bethany. Lifting up his hands, he blessed them. And while he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And so what we refer to as the ascension, Jesus is praying for them. So these are 2 things I'd like for us just to kind of summarize and for us to think about. As Jesus taught these wonderful lessons, sermons like the Sermon on the Mount, what we find is that his personal life was a complement and was consistent with the things that he taught verbally. And I know as human beings, we will never do that perfectly, but as we mature and as we grow and become more Christ-like, then I'd like to challenge us. It's not just what we hear, but it's what we do with what we know. And from small children, those of us that grew up in the church have sang about the wise man built his house upon the rock. Well, who was the wise man? He heard the teaching of Jesus, and he put those into practice. The second, which leads off of that, is that especially when we look at prayer, Jesus teaches wonderful things about prayer, teaches what we even call the Lord's Prayer. But as you look through his life, especially in Luke, his life is saturated with prayer from beginning to end. And so it's so appropriate as we have Affirming the Faith. It's so appropriate that we take time as a congregation to stop and pray for things that are coming. But I want to encourage you in your personal life to be thinking, this wasn't just a habit. This was just a way of life. And every significant event in the ministry and the life of Jesus is preceded by prayer. And I'm not trying to be sarcastic, and I'm not trying to be dramatic when I say this, but if that is the example that we have from Jesus, what an appropriate thing for us to do as well, because if we are his disciples, if we are followers, then here is an example. And see, there's some things in our personal lives that we can't do as we get older. You know, we can't run as fast, we aren't as mobile, a lot of other things. But you stop and think, all of our lives, from the time that we're very small until we get ready to go back home, this is one of those things that we can do if it's a priority in our life. And I would like to encourage us that our example complements the message of the gospel so that our lives become a part of the gospel. And secondly, that prayer become a regular part of our life, and as surely as we breathe and as surely as we eat meals through the day, let's be encouraging one another that prayer just be a normal part of who we are and how we live, because in our lives we're seeking to emulate and to follow the example that we have, and we too want to be disciples of the one who spent his life praying every time something significant came up in his life and his ministry. God bless. Thank you for the time to be together.